The Americans. Chapter 15, Immigrants and Urbanization. Section 1, The New Immigrants. In 1871, 14-year-old Fong Se came from China to Gold Mountain, the United States. Fong Se stayed, worked at menial jobs, and saved enough money to buy a business. Despite widespread restrictions against the Chinese, he became a very successful importer and was able to sponsor many other Chinese who wanted to enter the United States. Fong Se had achieved the American dream. However, as his great-granddaughter Lisa Se recalls, he was not satisfied. A personal voice, Lisa Se. He had been trying to achieve success ever since he had first set foot on the Gold Mountain. His dream was very American. He wanted to make money, have influence, be respected, have a wife and children who loved him. In 1919, when he traveled to China, he could look at his life and say he had achieved his dream. But once in China, he suddenly saw his life in a different context. In America, was he really rich? Could he live where he wanted? Did Americans care what he thought? The answers played in his head. No, no, no. Despite Fong Se's success, he could not, upon his death in 1957, be buried next to his Caucasian wife because California cemeteries were still segregated. Section 1, or Part 1, Through the Golden Door. Millions of immigrants like Fong Se entered the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, lured by the promise of a better life. Some of these immigrants sought to escape difficult conditions such as famine, land shortages, or religious or political persecution. Others, known as birds of passage, intended to immigrate temporarily to earn money and then return to their homelands. Europeans. Between 1870 and 1920, approximately 20 million Europeans arrived in the United States. Before 1890, most immigrants came from countries in Western and Northern Europe. Beginning in the 1890s, however, increasing numbers came from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1907 alone, about 1 million people arrived from Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Why did so many leave their homelands? Many of these new immigrants left to escape religious persecution. Whole villages of Jews were driven out of Russia by pogroms, organized attacks often encouraged by local authorities. Other Europeans left because of rising population. Between 1800 and 1900, the population in Europe doubled to nearly 400 million, resulting in a scarcity of land for farming. Farmers competed with laborers for too few industrial jobs. In the United States, jobs were supposedly plentiful. In addition, a spirit of reform and revolt had spread across Europe in the 19th century. Influenced by political movements at home, many young European men and women sought independent lives in America. Chinese and Japanese. While waves of Europeans arrived on the shores of the East Coast, Chinese immigrants came to the West Coast in smaller numbers. Between 1851 and 1883, about 300,000 Chinese arrived. Many came to seek their fortunes after the discovery of gold in 1848 sparked the California Gold Rush. Chinese immigrants helped build the nation's railroads, including the first transcontinental line. When the railroads were completed, they turned to farming, mining, and domestic service. Some, like Fong Se, started businesses. However, Chinese immigration was sharply limited by a congressional act in 1882. In 1884, the Japanese government allowed Hawaiian planters to recruit Japanese workers, and a Japanese emigration boom began. The United States annexation of Hawaii in 1898 resulted in increased Japanese immigration to the West Coast. Immigration continued to increase as word of the comparatively high American wages spread. The wave peaked in 1907 when 30,000 left Japan for the United States. By 1920, more than 200,000 Japanese lived on the West Coast, the West Indies, and Mexico. Between 1880 and 1920, about 260,000 immigrants arrived in the eastern and southern United States from the West Indies. They came from Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other islands. Many West Indians left their homelands because jobs were scarce, and the industrial boom in the United States seemed to promise work for everyone. Mexicans, too, immigrated to the United States to find work, as well as to flee political turmoil. In the 1902 National Reclamation Act, which encouraged the irrigation of arid land, created new farmland in western states and drew Mexican farm workers northward. After 1910, political and social upheavals in Mexico prompted even more immigration. About 700,000 people, 7% of the population of Mexico at the time, came to the United States over the next 20 years. Part 2. Life in the New Land. No matter what part of the globe immigrants came from, they faced many adjustments to an alien and often unfriendly culture. A difficult journey. By the 1870s, almost all immigrants traveled by steamship. The trip across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe took approximately 1 week, while the Pacific crossing from Asia took nearly 3 weeks. Many immigrants traveled in steerage, the cheapest accommodations, in a ship's cargo holds. Rarely allowed on deck, immigrants were crowded together in the gloom, unable to exercise or catch a breath of fresh air. They often had to sleep in louse-infested bunks and share toilets with many other passengers. Under these conditions, disease spread quickly, and some immigrants died before they reached their destination. For those who survived, the first glimpse of America could be breathtaking. A personal voice, Rosa Cavalieri. America! We were so near it seemed too much to believe. Everyone stood silent, like in a prayer. Then we were entering the harbor. The land came so near we could almost reach out and touch it. Everyone was holding their breath, me too. Some boats had bands playing on their decks, and all of them were tooting their horns to us and leaving white trails in the water behind them. Ellis Island. After initial moments of excitement, the immigrants faced the anxiety of not knowing whether they would be admitted to the United States. They had to pass inspection at immigration stations, such as the one on Castle Garden in New York, which was later moved to Ellis Island in New York Harbor. About 20% of the immigrants at Ellis Island were detained for a day or more before being inspected. However, only about 2% of those were denied entry. The processing of immigrants on Ellis Island was an ordeal that might take 5 hours or more. First, they had to pass a physical examination by a doctor. Anyone with a serious health problem or a contagious disease, such as tuberculosis, was promptly sent home. Those who passed the medical exam then reported to a government inspector. The inspector checked documents and questioned immigrants to determine whether they met the legal requirements for entering the United States. The requirements included proving they had never been convicted of a felony, demonstrating that they were able to work, and showing that they had some money, at least $25 after 1909. One inspector, Edward Farrow, an Italian immigrant himself, gave this glimpse of the process. A personal voice. Edward Farrow. The language was a problem, of course, but it was overcome by the use of interpreters. It would happen sometimes that these interpreters, some of them were really soft-hearted people and hated to see people being deported, and they would, at times, help the aliens by interpreting in such a manner as to benefit the alien and not the government. From 1892 to 1924, Ellis Island was the chief immigration station in the United States. An estimated 17 million immigrants passed through its noisy, bustling facilities. Angel Island. While European immigrants arriving on the East Coast passed through Ellis Island, Asians, primarily Chinese, arriving on the West Coast, gained admission at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. Between 1910 and 1940, about 50,000 Chinese immigrants entered the United States through Angel Island. Processing at Angel Island stood in contrast to the procedure at Ellis Island. Immigrants endured harsh questioning at a long detention in filthy, ramshackle buildings while they waited to find out whether they would be admitted or rejected. Cooperation for survival. Once admitted to the country, immigrants faced the challenges of finding a place to live, getting a job, and getting along in daily life while trying to understand the unfamiliar language and culture. Many immigrants sought out people who shared their cultural values, practiced their religion, and spoke their native tongues. Communities were life rafts for immigrants. People pooled their money to build churches and synagogues. They formed social clubs and aid societies. They founded orphanages and homes for the elderly and established cemeteries. They even published newspapers in their own languages. Committed to their own cultures, but also trying hard to grow their new identities, many immigrants came to think of themselves as hyphenated Americans. As hard as they tried to fit in, these new Polish and Italian and Chinese Americans felt increasing friction as they rubbed shoulders with people born and raised in the United States. Native-born people often disliked the immigrants' unfamiliar customs and languages and viewed them as a threat to the American way of life. Part 3. Immigration Restrictions. Many native-born Americans thought of their country as a melting pot, a mixture of people of different cultures and races who blended together by abandoning their native languages and customs. Many new immigrants, however, did not wish to give up their cultural identities. As immigration increased, strong anti-immigrant feelings emerged. The rise of nativism. One response to the growth of immigration was nativism, or overt favoritism toward native-born Americans. Nativism gave rise to anti-immigration groups and led to a demand for immigration restrictions. Many nativists believed that Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic ancestors of the English, were superior to other ethnic groups. These nativists did not object to immigrants from the right countries. Prescott F. Hall, a founder in 1894 of the Immigration Restriction League, identified desirable immigrants as British, German, and Scandinavian stock, particularly historically free, energetic, progressive. Nativists thought that problems were caused by immigrants from the wrong countries, Slav, Latin, and Asiatic races, historically downtrodden and stagnant. Nativists sometimes objected more to immigrants' religious beliefs than to their ethnic backgrounds. Many native-born Americans were Protestants and thought that Roman Catholics and Jewish immigrants would undermine the democratic institutions established by the country's Protestant founders. The American Protective Association, a nativist group founded in 1887, launched vicious anti-Catholic attacks, and many colleges, businesses, and social clubs refused to admit Jews. In 1897, Congress, influenced by the Immigration Restriction League, passed a bill requiring a literacy test for immigrants. Those who could not read 40 words in English or their native language would be refused entry. Although President Cleveland vetoed this bill, it was a powerful statement of public sentiment. In 1917, a similar bill would be passed into law in spite of President Woodrow Wilson's veto. Anti-Asian sentiment. Nativism also found a foothold in the labor movement, particularly in the West, where native-born workers feared that jobs would go to Chinese immigrants who would accept lower wages. The Depression of 1873 intensified anti-Chinese sentiment in California. Work was scarce, and labor groups exerted political pressure on the government to restrict Asian immigration. The founder of the Working Man's Party, Dennis Kearney, headed the anti-Chinese movement in California. He made hundreds of speeches throughout the state, each ending with the message, "The Chinese must go." In 1882, Congress slammed the door on Chinese immigration for 10 years by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act banned entry to all Chinese except students, teachers, merchants, tourists, and government officials. In 1892, Congress extended the law for another 10 years. In 1902, Chinese immigration was restricted indefinitely. The law was not repealed until 1943. The Gentleman's Agreement. The fears that had led to anti-Chinese agitation were extended to the Japanese and other Asian people in the early 1900s. In 1906, the local Board of Education in San Francisco segregated Japanese children by putting them in separate schools. When Japan raised an angry protest at this treatment of its immigrants, President Theodore Roosevelt worked out a deal. Agreement of 1907-1908, Japan's government worked out a deal under the Gentleman's Agreement, of 1907 to 1908, Japan's government agreed to limit emigration of unskilled workers to the United States in exchange for the repeal of the San Francisco Segregation Order. Although doorways for immigrants had been all but closed to Asians on the West Coast, cities in the East and the Midwest teemed with European immigrants and with urban opportunities and challenges.